welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Steph if you're new here. It is the 24th of December when I'm filming this, and as of right now I have read 150 books. I am hesitant to say that I already know what my best books of the year are because I'm still holding out that maybe I could read one more book on the 30th of December and it will be the most amazing thing I have ever read, but at this point I think that's unlikely. I've already read all the books that I was most anticipating, and so today I just thought I would chat about what some of my tops were and a few of my honorable mentions. So as usual, fantasy was my most read genre and horror came in as a close second. So just starting off with some of my honorable mentions, the very first one I want to talk about is Wise Children by Angela Carter. This book is hilarious. It is dry and witty and ironic and a bit of a slower pace, but you never really lose interest because the characters are so well put together. In it, we follow Dora, who is one of a set of twins, her sister being called Nora, and they are 75 when the book starts off. In it, she's recounting her life, but also exploring some of the estrangement from her father because she was never recognized as her father's child, being born out of wedlock. And their lives are quite colorful, as her and her sister are part of a song and dance team and closely connected to a Shakespearean theater troupe which her father leads. And this book is very character driven. It is every bit as bawdy and raucous as this theater and almost carnival-esque setting might suggest. It is super colorful and just absolutely a 5-star read for me. I really enjoyed it. The next up on my honorable mentions list is The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra Khaw. I recently discovered that she's actually a Malaysian author, which is really cool because I'm always looking to discover more Southeast Asian authors because I've been living in Singapore for quite some time now. And this is a novella. I would say it's just over 100 and something pages. It is fast-paced, it is enchanting, dark, magical, creepy, and really gory. And in it we follow a creepy mermaid. She has nasty teeth and she is fleeing from a kingdom with a plague doctor. And together they are traipsing through these snow-encrusted woods where they run into a group of children who they then kind of go and stay with, and these children are being led, or I wouldn't say cared for, by these 3 saints. That's all I can really say about it. It's very short, it's very eerie, and it's kind of gross. It's a horror. I just loved the lyrical writing and sort of emotional intensity and this dark fairy tale vibe to all of it. This was just such a fantastic surprise this year. Another darker horror kind of novella is The Crane Husband. This is inspired by Japanese mythology, originally The Crane Wife, and in it we follow a teenage girl who is kind of witness to her mother's new relationship, her crane husband, who is quite literally a crane. And in it, we explore trauma, violence, and the kind of mythologies and understandings that we build as women around living through different kinds of abuse. So there's a lot of content warnings in this one as well, but I just thought that the analogy that was being made and the themes that were explored were done super well, and I just loved the dark sort of fairy tale vibes to it. And my last honorable mention before I want to get into my absolute top 10 favorite books of the year is A Study in Drowning by Ava Reid. I had so much fun with this book. This is really close to being on my absolute top 10 list. If you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I'm obsessed with Ava Reid's writing, and this book is no different. This takes place in sort of a 1950s-esque secondary world that is inspired by Wales. And in it we follow Effie, who is an architecture student, and she's set to redesign a crumbling old manor house that used to belong to one of her favorite authors, who's kind of a mysterious character. And while she's doing it, she encounters a lot of challenging things, or things that are challenging for her, about who this guy was, that affects her understanding of, first of all, reality and her favorite book that he had written. There is a rivals to lovers romance in this as well. It deals with a lot of issues around authorship and women in history and women in literature, and I always love a good unhinged woman. Or is she unhinged? You have to read and find out. Okay, those were my honorable mentions. They're very honorable. I loved them all so much. It was so hard to decide which books were going to be on my absolute top 10. And I can't pick among my top 10 which are my top. It's really hard to compare them all because they're all just so good. But without further ado, first book that I want to talk about is Rouge by Mona Awad. I can't describe the experience of reading this book in any way other than it is like walking through a gothic Sephora. This is a magical realism, sort of literary leaning horror. We follow Belle, who returns home in the wake of her mother's death for the funeral, and Belle has this kind of insidious obsession with skincare videos. And while she's back home, she gets lured into this beauty cult that her mother may or may not have been involved in to some degree. And she's very unhinged, and you're constantly kind of asking this question of like, is this real? Is this really happening? Or is she just grieving and have a lot of baggage around her mother's death? It is really just such a wonderful read. It had me really intrigued just the entire time. This book is heavily inspired by Snow White and really explores a lot of ideas around beauty, but also how the idea of what is beautiful is passed from mother to daughter. It is not only one of my favorite books of this year, but I think it's probably going to be one of my favorite books of all time. That is Rouge, and I loved it so much. The next book that I want to talk about is One Dark Window. I have talked about this so much, so I'm gonna keep it brief. I read this in the very beginning of January, before I even had my channel, and this book has all of the gothic fantasy vibes that you might be looking for. It's set in a mist-locked town, and there is a tarot card inspired magic system. And we follow a young woman named Elspeth who is sharing her body, I guess, with a monster called Nightmare. Elspeth gets wound up with this kind of unlikely crew who are trying to break this mist so that they can pass through this enchanted, dark, creepy, evil forest and actually have contact with the rest of the world. I also read the sequel to One Dark Window, which is Two Twisted Crowns, and I just loved the whole duology. It was just such a great time. The next book that I want to talk about, I have the hard copy of, but it's already been packed because we're actually moving to Australia in less than 2 weeks. So that's a different video and a different update. But the third book that I want to talk about is The Bloody Chamber, again by Angela Carter. Angela Carter's writing style just really appeals to me, but I appreciate it the most in The Bloody Chamber because it's less frilly than it is in some of her other books. It still has very spooky, beautiful, dark, and haunting imagery, but I think that just really goes to show her mastery of the language and also themes and tropes that she's using in her writing. So The Bloody Chamber is a collection of short stories that are inspired by Western fairy tales, but they are all her own. They may draw from multiple different fairy tales at a time, and they all have this very dark, subversive, feminist twist to them. I actually would say that I think this collection is the epitome of a dark feminist fairy tale. So if you like Rouge, you might like The Bloody Chamber, and vice versa. The next book I want to talk about that I really enjoyed at the beginning of the year is The Ninth Reign. I feel like the Wind and Winged Flame trilogy is one of the most underhyped fantasies that are out there right now. I don't know why it doesn't seem to have a US publisher, but this is such a great book that blends fantasy and sci-fi together in a way that I've only really read in Gideon the Ninth before, because it does it so seamlessly. It just doesn't fit into either category neatly, and that is even more the case as you continue to read through the series. Some of the tropes we've got in this is a lady scientist, also an older female character, a young witch on the run, and a broody bloodsucker. So these three characters are kind of tossed together and are investigating this strange fluid that is left behind by these creatures that they are afraid will come back again and sort of prey on their country. They're kind of like aliens, they're kind of like insects, they're kind of creepy, and sometimes they're actually quite gross. A lot of people in this world are kind of in denial that they might make a return, but our three main characters are not so sure and are kind of reading the signs and preparing just in case. Total pivot, but the other book that I really enjoyed is The Seas by Samantha Hunt. This is a bit of an older book, and it is a very short kind of magical realism, very lyrical and like very poetic. It's about a young woman whose father disappeared into the sea in a very like isolated, I'm imagining it to be like northern British Columbia, Alaska, North Pacific West town. Her father, before disappearing, used to always tell her that she was a mermaid, so she really clings to the idea that she is a mermaid, and and the story of her grief and also her relationship with a much older man who was also a war veteran. The writing style of this book is such that the author could be talking about like a teacup and it would make me feel emotional. Like her ability to wield words and to infuse such emotion and symbolism and imagery into everything, to make the point that she's trying to get across is so well done. I just had such a great time reading this and I was really touched by it, and I think it's going to be an all-time favorite for quite a long time. Now I want to talk about a non-fiction that I absolutely enjoyed so much this year. I can't stop thinking about it, and that is The Facemaker. This is a book about the beginning and development of plastic surgery, particularly during World War I. Because in World War I, facial injury was quite common because they had these like little hard hats that would protect the brain. They keep you alive, but it didn't really do a whole lot to protect your face, particularly in trench warfare. So we had a huge amount of veterans that were coming back from the war and were quite badly disfigured and were often treated in a very different way compared to somebody who may have lost a limb. So this book details how during and after the war, people tried to regain or retain a sense of themselves through, first of all, having different kinds of masks and how this would affect them, but then also how doctors tried to reconstruct their faces to an extent to help these men recover their self-esteem and their ability to function, even like chewing. It might be a bit of a niche interest of mine, but I really thought that it was absolutely fascinating, and I feel like I learned so much about it, particularly when plastic surgery is so normalized now. So that's The Facemaker. I totally enjoyed it. If that kind of topic interests you, I feel like it is a very approachable and enjoyable nonfiction read. Highly recommend this book. I had to just put thank you for listening on this list just because I love audiobooks and I try not to listen to that many romance audiobooks, specifically because of the smut or the spice. I feel very uncomfortable listening to somebody reading that into my ear. And this book was so much fun because it's written by Julia Whelan, who is an audiobook narrator of like a lot of very popular, very famous romance books like Emily Henry's books. And her main characters are audiobook romance narrators, and she talks a little bit about like what the experience of that is like, narrating just in general, but also as somebody who is reading maybe more explicit or intimate scenes. So I found it kind of interesting and like sort of informative, as well as like very cute and very enjoyable as a romance book in itself. But I really hope that Julia Whelan continues to write romance because this was a really fun and interesting book to read. And I have to say that I think that the way that she writes would really appeal to people who enjoy Emily Henry's writing style and her characters. Like, they're a little bit quirky, not quite as quirky as an Emily Henry book. And there's definitely a very emotional undertone and like journey for each individual character as well. 3 left. Okay. Strange the Dreamer was a book that I read earlier in this year. And I know that this book was super popular a few years ago, but this is really a book that is written for people who love books. Laini Taylor has always been one of my favorite writers. She has a very dreamlike way about her stories. Like, there is something deeply magical to the plot and to the characters and to just the whole concept of them. So in it we follow Laszlo Strange and another character who I'm not going to talk about too much if you haven't read the book because it might be a little bit of a spoiler. But the book begins off with Laszlo Strange, who is a junior librarian, and he gets the opportunity to join a crew of people who are going to go find this mythical town of Weep, where something terrible happened, and we don't know what this town's real name actually originally was because everybody has forgotten. There's been a part of that town's history that has been erased, and now everybody calls it Weep. And they're gonna go and try to free Weep of, how do I explain this? Like, the shadow of what happened, literally and metaphorically. You might want to check the content warnings if there's anything you're super sensitive about, because it deals with some very heavy topics, but I think that it's done quite well, and any type of violence that occurs, there's many kinds, it happens off page, and you're kind of dealing with the people who have survived it and who are dealing with the fallout of it, if that makes sense. This is a series I'm definitely going to be rereading again in the future. I think about it again quite a bit, and I'm just really glad that I finally picked it up. My last 2 books are definitely horror leaning and very, again, fairy tale influenced. So the first one I want to talk about is The Girl in Red by Christina Henry. Now, this is a retelling of, you guessed it, Little Red Riding Hood. This was actually a super eerie book to read because it was released in the very beginning of 2019, and it's about a pandemic starting and people having to wear masks, and it really goes into it, and it's actually post-apocalyptic, so there's like a lot of other things. But you know how people say that Margaret Atwood is like kind of prophetic? Christina Henry had her prophetic moment writing this book, I think. So we're following Red. She is biracial and she also has a physical disability, and she is walking to her grandmother's house through this kind of post-apocalyptic landscape. Most people have gone to go and live in quarantine centers, which are allegedly safe from this virus that is rampant, but some people have not, and some of them are people who feel safer not living in close quarters during a pandemic with a bunch of other people. And some of them are white cis het men with big loud trucks and a lot of guns. I don't know how else to explain it. It might be a bit of a difficult book to read, and indeed sometimes it was, just because some of the things that Christina Henry is saying, like, oh, this could happen if there was a pandemic, it would amplify existing issues in our society, and it totally did. But one of the things that I really enjoyed about this book was the main character, Red. She is such a little hard ass. She's incredibly tough, incredibly competent, despite all of the things that might get in her way, all of the different barriers that she has to overcome. She is just super, super smart. She herself is a horror fan and thinks of herself as a final girl, and she is gonna be the final girl, and she's gonna get to grandma's house. So it was a super fun read, despite how dark and relevant it was. I really recommend it to anybody who's looking for just a really fun horror book, but also if you want like a really good retelling of Little Red Riding Hood. The last book on my list is also a novella, and I really can't say very much about it at all. I'm going to show you the cover. I'm going to tell you, please read this book. So the book is Comfort Me with Apples. This draws influence from biblical imagery, from classic fairy tale, Greek tragedy, and Greek mythology, and just so much else. My first impression was like, this is kind of Stepford Wives. I don't know if this is gonna be for me, but I kept going, and I'm glad that I did, because at about 30% through, I was just like, wait a damn second, what's going on here? There is something tricky going on here. The author is doing something, and then by 70%, you know where this is going. My brain exploded. And then you hit the end, and that last page, you should read it. I strongly suggest that you read it. Doubly, triply, if you enjoy Rouge, if you enjoyed The Bloody Chamber, if you want any kind of dark fairy tale-esque, super feminist horror book that you can read in like 2 hours or less. So those are my favorite books of 2023. I can't believe that we're almost at 2024. I'm a little freaked out about it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I would love to hear about what books were your favorite, what your thoughts were about any of the books that were on my list. And Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year's, whatever. If you're celebrating anything, have a great solstice, and I will see y'all next week.